Hello, everyone. My name is Christian Forrest, and this is Alexander John Lee. We were both students in Russia before and during the war with Ukraine. So we both studied at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, and we became acquainted in Moscow. We became good friends. So we're just doing this episode right now to talk about our experiences in Russia, studying at MGIMO, and just what we think about things.
Yeah. This is Christian's idea of creating this video just sort of to talk about our experiences, and we have some questions that we want to ask each other. And I think it's a good video format because there's not a lot of information on the internet, like Americans studying at Moscow State Institute of International Relations. And I feel like it's a very niche thing. I don't think there's that many people out there that would be interested to study at MGIMO. But I think making this video might help some people, and just kind of talk about our experience is actually a really good idea. So
Well, I was actually going to say, I think that it's precisely important because it is niche, right? Like MGIMO is historically known as Russia's best university, but it's sort of like hidden knowledge. If you Google Russia's best university, you're just going to see Moscow State, not MGIMO. I think that hopefully through this interview, we can give people a little bit of a glimpse into that world of the Russian elite, like studying with the children of oligarchs and all things like that.
yeah. All right. So
So
do you just want to start with the questions? Like, do you want to you have a list of questions here. I have a list of questions for you. Do you want to just like go back and forth? Like you start with your first question. We'll use that as sort of like a starting point for a conversation, or how do you see it?
yeah, no, definitely. Well, we'll use the starting point to see where the conversation takes us. But I guess the first thing that would be useful is, Alex, could you just like explain what got you interested in Russia? Like, how does the story of you going to MGIMO begin?
Yeah. So I am originally from Knoxville, Tennessee, and I was born here. I grew up here, but my mom is Russian. So my dad actually in the early '90s, right after the Soviet Union fell, he went to Moscow. He was working for like a telecom company, and he had just graduated from law school, and that's how we met my mom in Moscow. And so I always like grew up like speaking a little bit of Russian with my mom, but I never thought I would ever move to Russia by any means. Like that's and I was interested in international relations because you always hear about, Russia on the news in the United States. And I was like, okay, I want to get into international relations. And like so I applied to George Washington University and American and Georgetown. I didn't get into Georgetown. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go study Russian in Russia for a semester, and then I'll reapply to Georgetown. Thank God I never got into Georgetown. Otherwise, I would have that would have been a disaster. I'm so glad I found MGIMO.
I was just going to say, isn't it crazy how one thing in life that is a setback can actually lead to even
I know.
greater opportunities?
It's insane. Like I don't know, like that would be interesting to like hear your experience about like, going to college in the United States, because I look at some of my friends from high school and I'm like thinking like that would have been a nightmare going to college in the United States.
Well,
So
well, just in short, as someone who studied in both the United States and Russia, I can say that I prefer Russian education a lot more than American education.
yeah, it's much more serious. I kind of feel like I mean, in the United States, I don't know. Like, at first, it's kind of a shock because you get to MGIMO and you're like, oh my God, what did I sign up for? Like, you get to the dorm there. I mean, they've built a new dorm since, like, you know, we left, but you get to that first dorm and you're like, oh my God. And you see it on like Instagram stories and stuff, your friends are like in these super nice dorms, and you're like thinking, what did I sign up for? But then once you realize that you're not going into debt, like some of my friends like have like $300,000 worth of debt.
That's great.
It's like ridiculous, dude. It's ridiculous. And yeah, so I don't know. It's just so that's how I discovered MGIMO. Like I didn't know about MGIMO. Like I found some random girl on YouTube in high school who's talking about, she did a vlog about MGIMO, and I was like, that looks really interesting. And also my mom was also telling me like, Alex, you'll never get into MGIMO. It's like this super elite university. Like there's
Wow.
no way. So I was like, Mom, I'm gonna prove you wrong.
So,
So yeah.
I mentioned earlier that MGIMO is like a little bit of a niche university, like it's specialty knowledge, it's the best. So your mom, as being from Russia, she had that specialty knowledge of MGIMO being the best.
Exactly. Yeah, anyone from like any CIS country, like post-Soviet region, they know what MGIMO is. And if you meet a Russian person in the United States, they definitely know MGIMO. But most American people don't know what MGIMO is unless they're like from, they studied at some like Russian studies thing or something in the US. Then they've heard of MGIMO. But yeah, but I want to hear your story. How did you find out about MGIMO? Like that is also very random. So tell me, okay, first, let me structure my question a little bit better here for you. So like, I know you went to college in Utah, right?
Yeah.
Studying
So I'll explain a
economics.
little.
And then how did you get
Yes.
to Moscow?
Oh, it's a crazy story. Anyway, so my family's Mormon, which I mean, people know what Mormons are, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So when I was raised, I pretty much had three options of going to college: BYU, Brigham Young University, Utah State University, and University of Utah. And for those of you that don't know, Mormon culture is really it's a very strict, high demand religion. So, for example, in Mormonism, you can only date and marry other Mormons. So, even though I'm from Los Angeles, every single Mormon I know, every single one of them without fail, studies in Utah because not only is it a rite of passage, it's theoretically how you're going to meet your future spouse. So it's almost like a mating protocol. So anyway, so when I was like in high school, I didn't really have much creativity about where I was thinking about applying to school. I was always interested in like international things. I think at one point I just like research studying in Sweden, perhaps, just like, just a whim. But anyway, I knew I was always going to be in Utah. Anyway, I go to Utah. In Mormonism, we have something called a mission, which is like a 2-year rite of passage. It's incredibly strict set of rules. And essentially, the idea is that whenever a young Mormon man becomes 18 years old or 19, you submit your application in the mail, and Mormons believe that God chooses where you're going to go on your mission. So it could be anywhere in the world. It could be Utah, Arizona, Africa. And I got my mission called to Sweden. The mission was not for me whatsoever. That whole topic could be another episode. But anyway, it was through going on my Mormon mission. I had never learned a language before, but all of a sudden I was in the missionary training center and I was studying Russian. No, not Russian. I was studying Swedish, and I was learning Swedish really fast. And simultaneously at the same time, I developed this love and interest in Russian literature. So anyway, I learned the mission was not for me, but my mission gave me the skills and confidence to know that I can learn other languages. So my interest in Russian literature flourished. Got back from my mission. I was like, okay, I know Swedish now, might as well study Russian. So I went back to Utah, and the good thing about these big public state universities in America is that no one studies abroad. Like I'm sure if you go to Harvard and you apply to study at MGIMO, every single person is going to apply. But Utah State, I was literally the only applicant. So not only did I get accepted, they gave me scholarships. I didn't pay a cent of tuition that semester. It was like a free vacation abroad. I went to St. Petersburg, and just like the Russian soul and everything that I discovered in Russian literature, I realized was actually true. I went to Russia and I encountered the super intellectual, smart people. Everyone was so soulful. I just loved. I think when you go to Western countries and you walk around, everyone seems very miserable. And when I first went to St.
Not
Petersburg,
always, not always, not always, but
not always. Um, but my first impression is like, I think I was 19 at the time. As a 19 or 20-year-old man going to St. Petersburg, I was like, oh my gosh, like people seem so happy and content with their lives. Anyway, went to St.
did
Petersburg.
you go in the winter time or in the summer? What time of year
Winter.
were you there? Winter. Okay, that's interesting. And you thought that in the winter time in St. Petersburg, you were like, wow, you were impressed by everything.
Yeah. Line, so it's not like private information. But my theory about Russians and Russian people is that when you're in a place like America, it legitimately seems like 60% of people are like NPCs. Like you just look at them and there's like no light in their eyes, there's no soul. It just seems like they're the product of axioms, and they're automating they're acting on like a basic set of rules and like ideologies that they've been programmed into. But when I went to Russia, I looked at the people, and like the amount of light and soulfulness in their eyes was incredible to me, that I knew I was like, I can't go back to Utah after this. So anyway,
Yeah, and I've thought about this as well. Like I'm back in the States right now, and like I've noticed this. I've been back for a month from Moscow, and the reason why I'm back is for my visa. I've reapplied for my visa. I'm going back to Moscow soon. But I noticed that like people, I think the reason why people are like you say these NPCs here, and they're not. It's like there is no intellectual like stimulation here or something. Like it's like you're in the United States, you're like on this island, and everything
Mhm.
happens outside of this island. Like you hear about like all the history and like world events, and it's like not anywhere near the United States. That's what I like about living in Russia, is that like you see like historical events happening in front of your eyes, like just
Absolutely.
random stuff, just random. Like at MGIMO, for example, like I don't know if you saw any like heads of state come to MGIMO. Like I got to see the King of Saudi Arabia. MBS's Mohammed bin Salman's dad came to MGIMO. I met some. I mean, I didn't meet them. When I say meet, I mean I was like in the same room with them, listening to them talk. Some like random African presidents and like all these like Russian politicians and Sergei Lavrov and all these interesting people. So like in Russia, you see history happening like in front of your eyes, whereas in the United States, it's like it's just you're on this like you're in this intellectual desert or something. There's like no stimulation. I don't know what it is. I don't know. One hand, it's really good because like here I am in this camper, like coding, like working on my stuff, and like there's no distraction, so like it's really really good. But the flip side of that, there's no stimulation, so there's like pluses and minuses to it. I mean, it's like so
Um, yeah, no, definitely. I definitely agree with you, especially at MGIMO, feeling like you're part of something bigger. You see important stuff happen in front of your eyes. I was actually going to mention that. I remember one time I was in the dormitories at MGIMO, and there was this Asian guy like moving boxes or something. He was like helping a student move in, and he's wearing a suit. And I looked down, and he has a Kim Jong Un pin on. So
yeah.
of course in Russian, I asked him, "Откуда вы?" I was like, "Where are you from?" And he just looks at me and says, "Korea." So, so,
Yeah.
so, so of course I asked him which Korea, and he's like North Korea, and I was like, oh my gosh, like where else besides MGIMO are you gonna randomly encounter some North Korean, like I don't know if he's a helper or whatever, diplomatic envoy, just randomly in the dormitory?
I know. I've met a lot of North Koreans as well at MGIMO. I remember my first year, I was doing the economics program at MGIMO, and that was a mistake. I did one
Did
semester of that.
One question, did you switch to international relations?
Yeah. So I initially applied and I like got into their economics program, and I did a semester of that, and I realized this is not what I signed up for, and I switched to international relations, which was a much better fit. The reason why is just like all this math, and I like math. I like this is my job nowadays, building all these financial like software engineering things. But like the way they teach it in Russia, like coming from the United States, like you learn math in high school, and then like I did like calculus, pre-calculus in high school in 12th grade, and then you come here and it's like three-dimensional, like integrals, and like on the first day I'm just like, bro, this is not what I signed up for. But yeah, there's this North Korean dude in my math class, and he was also really struggling, and we had to take the calculus test. So like it in Russian like universities, you have to like you fail, you get 3 attempts of like taking the exam. The first attempt you're supposed to pass, but if you don't pass, you get another attempt, and then you get a third attempt, and third attempt's like your last attempt before they kick you out. And that's like completely different like American universities. Like if they like once you're into an American university, there's no way you're getting kicked out. Like unless you
Absolutely.
plagiarize. Or in Russia, dude, if you're like it's hard to get into MGIMO, but I think it's even harder to stay in MGIMO.
Yeah.
Like you
Yeah.
it's like this extreme intellectual marathon for
Mhm.
4 years if you do the bachelor program. Where
Yeah.
it's like,
I was
yeah,
just gonna say, going back to the differences between American and Russian universities, if you look at like the investment decisions of American universities, they're essentially operating a theme park, right? They build these big football stadiums.
it's a
They
hedge
have
fund.
party reputations, right? Like ASU tries to attract people specifically to party. It's all about the experience. Where I think in Russia, like you said, it's an intellectual marathon. When you
Yeah,
enroll in Russian university, like you think it's going to be a fun walk in the park, but they take it seriously.
take it very seriously. One thing I really like about Russian education is the fact that all the exams are oral. It doesn't matter what subject, it can be in humanities to mathematics. Like mathematics even has oral exams. Like I had some like I worked with some people from MFA to E. MFA to E is considered like Russia's MIT essentially. And I asked them like, how do you guys' like exams go through, like the high level math courses? And it's like all oral as well. Like yeah, they have like on the lower level math exams, it's all like paper, you answer questions and stuff. But still, like that's what I really like about Russian education is that like they force you to memorize stuff. Even if you cheated, you're still gonna learn something. Like that's another interesting thing. I don't know what your shock was like when you first came to like MGIMO and you see people just cheat. Because that was a big shock for me. Like coming from my high school, like we had these plaques in high school. It says, "I will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do." And they like drill that into you in the United States, where like cheating is like bad and everything. Whereas in Russia, the educational system's like, we want you to cheat, like because we know if you cheat, it's like you're gonna learn something. Like that's literally that was a huge shock for me. What did you think about that?
It's definitely a cultural shock. Like, I think I originally encountered that in St. Petersburg, where like I think it was during a Russian language exam, and there was a girl who was studying abroad, and like it's like during the test, and she just takes out her phone and starts Google translating, and I was looking around like, what on earth is going on here?
Yeah,
Going back to what you said about like the oral examinations, I think that's really important. I know this one girl who works in management consultancy, and we are just like talking about like CVs and how to make a good CV and all that. And she was telling me that she really markets herself as someone who's good with people and good with numbers because those things really don't overlap very much. But I think in
yeah.
the Russian model, it's really important because you can have someone studying financial economics, like econometrics, advanced statistics, but it's like they have to be able to talk about it.
Yeah, I think the Russian educational system, it really, I don't know. It's like, I mean, they criticize it like Russians nowadays sort of criticize the trend where the Russian educational system is going, especially with like their standardized exams and stuff. And that's like definitely the Russians like looked at the SAT, ACT in the United States and like we need to copy that because everything in America is good. That was like early 90s when like that
At two
system was put in.
thousands.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that's really bad. I think they just gotta stick with their Soviet style of like just the oral exams for absolutely everything because
Yeah.
they give you like 50. I don't know how it was for the master's program. Like you had, they give you like a list of like 50 questions and said like this is,
Yeah.
and they like pull out a random
Yeah,
set of
no, it's
questions.
crazy. I mean, honestly, so from a game theoretic point of view, in terms of maximizing incentives, it's the perfect way to get people to learn. So as Alexander was saying, the way it works in Russia is they will give you a long list of like 76 questions and say you might be asked any of these two questions and only these two questions on the oral exam. So you need to learn the entire list. And let me say, so when I studied for American examinations, right, the majority of them were multiple choice. I don't want to say that they could be gamed fairly easily, but it's pretty much like go read a textbook, read the index, memorize the definitions, and you'll do well on the ABCD whatever exam. For Russia, I literally felt like I had to dive into the history of international relations to learn anything. Otherwise, I'm gonna have some Boris who's like, "What is the history of 1939?"
Yeah,
Whatever.
I know. What? So you studied economics at uh, what was
Utah
the
State.
university again? Uh, in
Utah State.
Utah? Utah State. Okay, like what was there like I don't know, like an ideology at the department? Were they more like Keynesian or were they more like Austrian economics? Like what
So
was like the vibe of the department there?
So yeah, this is interesting. So as I said, like when I went to Russia, like I really wanted to leave the United States and American education behind me for a little bit. But to be completely fair, I did like my economics department at Utah State. They were very libertarian, received a lot
Hmm,
of like Koch brother funding. So I
okay.
I just remember because there's a stereotype that like modern universities like very woke. But I remember I walked into my Econ 101 class and the professor was saying like these like crazy outrageous things. I mean, all true things, the things that were very controversial. So my econ education, I think, was actually I no nothing against it.
So it wasn't like a shock coming from like a US university to like MGIMO where it's like the
So
philosophy at MGIMO is more like realist, like
yeah,
whereas realist in terms of international relations and libertarian in terms of like economics.
so so
So it wasn't a shock for you.
this is actually a very important distinction to make. And I don't know if you know this because you only studied in Russia. But the way curriculum works in the US is very different because you have to take a long set of gen eds in the US, like English, sociology,
Yeah.
introduction to art. So I loved my econ classes, but in terms of ideology, the rest of the university was absolutely consumed by I guess what you'd call woke ideology, which is actually surprising. It was surprising
Mm.
me because like I specifically went to Utah not only because of my Mormon experience, but also because I wanted to encounter new ideas. California is sort of known as a bastion of woke and social justice and all of that, so I was really surprised to encounter it in Utah.
Mm. That's one thing I really appreciated about MGIMO is that there was truly freedom of speech, I felt like, at MGIMO. I mean, it changed. I'm going to be completely honest. Like 20, so I started studying at MGIMO in the fall of 2017, and I finished in the spring of 2023. So I was there because I did a year learning Russian before I applied to the, full-time bachelor program. Then during COVID, I just came back to the US because I didn't want to be locked in like an apartment in Russia. So I took a year off. So that's why it took me like 5 years to finish my bachelor's degree. But um, so like in 2018, I do remember people and even sort of professors criticizing the government, the Russian government. Like not like openly like we're pro Navalny, like, oh my God, we gotta go vote for Navalny. No. It was just like more on terms of like foreign policy, very academic type of things.
Yeah, of course.
Um, and so yeah, like that was some that I noticed. After 2020, so like, February 2022, I did feel a slight shift, um, where I think the diversity of like ideas sort of shifted to like, it's like if you had an Overton window where it's like the span of ideas, possible permutations of ideas that could be discussed, like I wouldn't say it went to the right or to the left. It kind of narrowed or something. Like something happened in February 2022 where like people just stopped discussing. It was just like only mainstream ideas. Let's just discuss mainstream type of ideas. That's sort of what I noticed. I don't know if you were there during the beginning of the war or what happened. Where were you? But that's something that I noticed.
So I defended my thesis at MGIMO during the war in June or July 2022. But I was going to ask, so that change in the Overton window, do you think that was anything having to do with the university, or was that mainly just like the mentality of people that they
I
didn't
think
want to discuss it?
I think it's just people were just very shocked.
Mhm.
I think MGIMO professors sort of knew like this was it was inevitable it was going to get to this point, like just with everything. But I kind of felt like, yeah, the professors just sort of, I mean, no one's going to start like criticizing the Russian government during a war. You know what I mean? So that's sort of like what I noticed. I mean, it's obvious, but
I think it's one of those things where it was just such an extreme thing to happen. Like I'm sure you'd see the same thing at American universities. Like if we fully
yeah,
went to war with Mexico, all of a sudden people would be like, "Well, I don't really know what to say about this."
yeah, I'm going to stop going to the Mexican restaurant or whatever. Like that would be the equivalent or whatever. So like, yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
but anyways, I just wanted to say, going back to my story. Anyway, so I studied abroad in St. Petersburg, absolutely loved it. COVID happened. My university said you need to come home. I was like, well, I don't want to come home. So we ended up going into negotiations, and I realized that if I came back on the terms that I established, I could take more classes and I could finish my bachelor's degree an entire year early. So
mm,
I managed to turn this bad thing into a good thing because I came home, did summer school, finished the entire bachelor's degree, saved a lot of tuition money, and I was like, well, I've saved myself all this time. Might as well go back to Russia as a master's student. And I was like, if I'm going to go to Russia, I should go to the best university. Applied at MGIMO, one of the best decisions I've ever made, and that's how I went there.
yeah. Did you So I know you got married recently, like,
Yeah.
and so did you meet your wife at MGIMO or how did you guys meet in Moscow?
Um, yeah, so we met as English teachers in Russia. So after graduation from MGIMO, I stayed to teach English for a year. Not my favorite job in the world, but as a foreigner, it's one of the few things that's pretty easy to do. But anyways, the good thing, one thing I should say about Russia, especially now during the war, is that I would say that Russia's a very good ideological filter. Like whenever you go to MGIMO or someone, you meet a bunch of like-minded individuals. So I always thought, statistically speaking, that I was going to end up with a Russian girl because I was in Russia, right? But it just so happened that like there's such a big filter that's been placed that like imagine what type of crazy girl it takes the crazy mentality would take a Western girl to move to Russia during the war. And that's exactly the type of girl that I was ultimately compatible with my wife. So we met at the same English teaching company. We went on our first date. We just immediately jumped the gun, started talking about philosophy, politics, realized that we were on board for everything. Super good fit. She actually texted her best friends the first night that we met that she could imagine herself marrying me. So we just had this immediately super strong connection. After a few weeks, we started dating. We traveled a lot in Russia together. We went to Chechnya, we went to Murmansk, we went to Volgograd, and we ultimately left Russia because I wanted to. I love my time in Russia. I hope that I go back one day, but I wanted to leave and focus a little bit more on building a career back home. And we ended up getting married in Tbilisi.
Oh, cool, cool. Yeah, that's really interesting. Like you said, it is an ideological filter. In many ways, it's good because you filter out all the LGBTQ woke agenda BLM people. None of those people ever will move to Russia. So like that's what is good about living in Russia. But I mean, yeah, it is. This is the thing. Like people really, and like Russian people kind of get mad at me when I start talking like this, but I want to be very clear that there's no perfect place on earth. Like every place has its pros and its cons. And, like when I say something that's sort of slightly negative about Russia, I'm not saying it's like it's a bad place. I'm just saying like that's just a point that needs
Pros
to be
and
taken
cons.
into consideration. Yeah, it's pros and cons. Overall, it's honestly better to live in Russia today than it is probably in the United States or other places, even in Europe. So yeah, like it is an ideological filter, like Russia is, but that also can create this lack of diversity of thought. And like this, one thing that I noticed after the war was like in my field, like with all these like software engineering people and stuff, I just felt like there was a lot less people in the field. Like they left, a lot of people left to like, Georgia, a lot of people moved to Amsterdam, a lot of people moved to Cyprus. Uh, and that was one thing that I did not like because like the diversity of like intellectual idea, and this is like these people aren't political at all. These are just software engineer people working on like blockchain stuff. And it was kind of a shock when like you realize that a lot of really smart dudes left. But I do think that like in the future it's going to change again. I think a lot of those people, they sort of like a lot of Russian people, I think they idealize the West way too much. Like, and I think that when they go abroad and then they live there for a little bit, they actually come back to Russia and they're like, all things considered, this place is actually a lot better than living in the West. So
I was
that's
gonna
my hope.
I think you have that stereotype of there'll be like an attractive Russian girl. She sort of meets like an American guy. The American guy's like, "Oh, I'm gonna bring you back to Cincinnati." She thinks that America's going to be this wonderful place. Then she gets to America and she's like, "Oh my gosh, Moscow was 1,000 times better."
I know Moscow is insane how technologically advanced it is. Like, I mean, you can be against the whole Face ID thing when you're getting onto the metro. I mean, I get it, but still, like, there's nothing like that. I saw a video today where, like, the mayor of Paris or something was like showing off that you could pay for her metro ticket in Paris with her phone. Now, that's like a big deal for the Paris Olympics. I'm thinking, like, that is so ridiculous. Moscow has had that for the past, like, 5 years,
Definitely.
like, so yeah, that's, but I wanted to ask you, like, what did you change in any way living in Russia? Like
Ooh,
for
I got
good, maybe for the worse? Like, I don't know.
mm, that's a great question. I was gonna say, well, I mean, honestly, as an American, tell me if you can relate to this. You have a little bit more of an international background than I do, but the first time when you leave America for real, it legitimately feels like you're leaving the cave, like Plato's allegory.
Mm,
Like as an American who grew up in this insular society, and I'm from Los Angeles, right? You expect it to be metropolitan. The moment I went to St. Petersburg, I realized that I knew nothing about the world. I studied economics, yet I knew so little about how the world works that I didn't understand how the US dollar was like a strong currency. Like I was surprised when I got to St. Petersburg and realized that I could eat out for like $5. I realized that there was so much I didn't know. I didn't know where Uzbekistan was. I didn't know where Kazakhstan is. I didn't know where Moldova was. I didn't know where many places were. So I would say that my horizon, like I think a lot of Americans, they opportunities, right? So they're thinking, oh, I need to go to Harvard, I need to go to Columbia, I need to study this, I need to work in an investment bank. And while there certainly can be good career paths, the truth is that we live in an incredibly diverse world that is filled with so many different opportunities. Going back to English teaching, right? I know someone, a Canadian, who he was an English teacher. And by the way, English teaching can be good money because it's usually rich Russian parents who are willing to pay. Anyway, this Canadian guy, he was an English teacher, but from that English teaching position, he got a job as a governor, which is essentially like a nanny. So he just like babysits these children of Russian oligarchs, and he makes 500,000 rubles a month, which is $60,000 a year. Which I was making $10,000 a year, which means that he could theoretically save $50,000 a year, and he's babysitting.
Yeah, the problem that I have with expats teaching English, and I want to hear your perspective on this,
so I'm not
is I taught English my first 2 years at as a student at MGIMO just like to pay for basic stuff, and it makes good. You can make good money, make like $25-$30 an hour teaching English. Like it's great. The problem though is that it's like this, as a native English speaker, it's like an intrinsic skill. It's like English speaking, and it's like, what about you didn't learn that skill? That you were born with that, like, and now you're like marketing yourself. So I look at that and I think like it's like these a lot of, and this is the problem I have with a lot of expat people in Moscow, like Americans in Moscow, is that their whole identity revolves around them, this intrinsic value that they're a native English speaker and then they're from the United States. And I'm like thinking like, how like uncultured and uninteresting do you have to be, like, so where your whole identity is something that's like about you that you were just born with. I don't know. That's what really bothers me about teaching English, and I got really tired of it.
No, I
because
agree.
of that.
I agree with you completely. I mean, that's part of the reason that I gave up English teaching is because I feel like I studied economics, I studied international relations. I felt like I'd been to so many places and developed such good analytical abilities and such a good understanding of the world. And now it's like I'm teaching red, blue, yellow. So I felt like I was squandering my potential. And it's like I love being in Russia, but is it worth it to stay in Russia if this is what I have to do?
Yeah. I know. I mean, and look, I worked for one software engineering company in Russia as a back-end TypeScript developer. And like when I worked, I was like, there's no way. After that experience, there's a video on my Instagram where the boss, dude, is like calling me up because they didn't pay me. I worked there for like a month, and like they paid me for like the first 2 weeks, and then the last 2 weeks they didn't pay me. And I'm like, okay, this is really annoying. So I texted him. I was like, hey man, when are you gonna like pay me? And then he doesn't respond. And then I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go to their social media page. And because he's like this CEO guy of this company, and he also is like talking about how he's this like entrepreneur dude, and like how like much money he has. Like, look at me, I'm driving this nice car. And then I posted like a comment under his video, and I was like, you drive around on these nice cars, but you don't have enough money to pay your employees. It triggered him so bad. And then he like comes after me. He's like, this is Russia. You think you're an American. You're bringing your democracy to Russia. And they're like, this is Russia. This is not a democracy. I'm like, okay. We have an agreement, a legal signed agreement in Russian. Like, I'm legal to work. Everything was solid, and I'm getting like these threats. I was like, okay, goodbye. So like that's one thing I like living in Russia, dude. I'm moving back there like 100%. But the business culture is not developed, dude. Like they think that it's like this mafioso, like let's just bully this dude so he doesn't we don't have to pay him. Like, no. So I don't know. That's
Going back to what you said about mafioso culture, it's really interesting because I feel like if you're in a place like London or anywhere in the West, right, you should not try to look wealthy when you're walking around because that's a recipe for getting robbed. In Moscow, I think it's the opposite. If you walk around wearing the wool pea coat, if you look like an oligarch, people step out of the way for you. Like people
I
think
know.
that you mean business.
I think it's yeah, that's actually an interesting point. Yeah. Um,
So go you mentioned that you have a lot of friends that have gone into insane levels of debt to fund their university education in the United States. I wanted to ask you if you know the exact numbers for the typical international undergraduate student at MGIMO, what can they expect to pay for a degree per year?
yeah, so I think my first year I was paying around 260,000 rubles a year, which at the time with the exchange rate, that's about $5,000 or something like that, a little under that. And by the end, I was paying, I think 580,000 rubles a year. So it was about $5,000 to $6,000 a year for just tuition.
Okay, so
Living expenses is about, I would say, at least
yeah.
15.
So
Yeah,
so
so
you say that it's fair to say that it's like approximately the same price of like a cheap state school in the US, but
yeah.
with almost all the cost of living is a lot lower, so you save on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was super lucky to have parents that, were willing to sponsor all of that. I mean, I don't think, um, I mean, I wouldn't have been able to
So
do it without my parents for sure. Yeah, there's
so
connection issues or
it
something.
broke up for a second. Could you repeat that?
Yeah. Yeah, so I was just saying, like, I'm super thankful that I wouldn't have been able to do it with my parents. Like, absolutely, like, 100% thanks to my parents, I was able to go to MGIMO. Yes, it was cheaper than any state school in the United States, but still, I got a lot of help from my parents.
Okay, great. Let's see. Let me go back to the list of questions we have. Oh, what are your favorite memories from MGIMO?
Oh man. Oh, I'll tell you one. I'll tell you a good one. So at MGIMO, you get to meet a lot of cool people. Is there still connection issues, by the way? Like, do you hear me
No, no, no.
good?
It's good now.
Okay, all right, cool. Yeah, one of the most interesting experiences I had at MGIMO. So at MGIMO, they had this startup competition. I was like, okay, I worked at a hedge fund during COVID. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna have some experience like with startups and stuff. I'm gonna apply for this startup competition, see what happens. And the startup competition was funded by, so like the promise was it was like a month of lectures where you go to some lecture hall and the person reading the lectures was Ksenia Shaigu. That's the daughter of the foreign or
Oh,
the minister
oh
of
wow.
defense. So I was like, I gotta win this thing. My goal is like I'm going to win the startup competition. And the promise was if you win, you get a paid internship at Ksenia Shaigu's hedge fund for the summer. I was like, okay, I'm winning this thing. No one is gonna come close. So I do my startup pitch thing and I end up winning. I got first place. So, but at the end, when everything was done, I was like, they gave me the internship. They're like, actually, it's not paid. I was like,
Oh.
okay, that's not what I signed up for, but whatever. But yeah, I actually got to work with very briefly for like just a little bit, work with some of Ksenia Shaigu's hedge fund analyst people. That was a
Wow.
really cool experience. That was like really, really random and really, really cool.
So going back to this, you're doing all of this in Russia. You're working at Russian hedge funds, but you also mentioned that you learned Russian for a year before MGIMO. So I wanted to ask, did you learn Russian from nothing? You said you spoke a little bit of Russian growing up. How did you get to the point where your Russian is good enough to actually contribute value to a Russian hedge fund?
Yeah, I mean, my mom like spoke to me in Russian, so I sort of knew Russian, but it was really bad. I couldn't read or write. Like when I got to MGIMO, they're like, you cannot apply to the bachelor's program because like you don't know how to read or write. You don't even know how to write your name in Russian. Like so I was like, okay, whatever. I'll do a year of your Russian program. But also, I think I'm pretty good with languages. I mean, I took French at MGIMO, like so I took the Russian to French, French to Russian translation for 4 years. So yeah, I mean, I just think if the same with you. I mean, you're good with languages. I mean, it's just like I don't think Russian's any more difficult than. I mean, it's more difficult than like Spanish, but and it's not like that hard of a language, I don't think. I mean, yes, it's hard, but once you like, if you're just conversational, like, I think you can learn it pretty quickly if you're living there.
Definitely. I was going to say, going back to the foreigners that we met at MGIMO, I would say in addition to English teaching, the one gripe that I sort of have with them is that I think that when you do something crazy like studying at MGIMO, there's almost like this unearned valor that you have. Like, I'm not saying the people that we know like have egos, right? But for example, who Lord Miles is, the British guy.
No.
You don't know.
No. Who's that?
The story is that when Afghanistan fell, there was this random British guy who was just like there on vacation because he wanted to see the fall of Afghanistan because it was on the news, and he actually ended
In
up
what year? The fall when the Soviets invaded, or when recently Joe Biden
Joe
withdrew?
Biden.
Okay.
But anyway, so if you listen to Lord Miles talk about his experience there, he's like, yeah, I was just a tourist in Afghanistan. And he's like, I was there with UN diplomats and like military peacekeepers and all this stuff. And I feel like going to MGIMO is like a little bit of the same thing. Like we get access to this world as foreigners, and we get to see a bunch of really, really cool stuff. But it's almost like we haven't done much to deserve it. Um, so, like, for example, I think normally for an American to get to Russia and see the things that we've seen, they'd have to become like the top US hostage negotiator or have some insane
Yeah, sure.
position. So we're very fortunate, but I think it does give the foreigners a sense of like unearned valor.
Maybe. I think, like you said earlier in our talk, like conversation, we you talked about like this filter. Living in Russia is this filter, and like I've seen it where people like Americans come to MGIMO, they try to learn the language, they try to do their thing, and within a year to 18 months, they're gone because they can't handle it. And so I think, yeah, it maybe is unearned valor in some way, but at the same time, like it's just automatic filter where if some Westerner is in Moscow, they're doing
Yeah.
something that's outside of the normal standard deviation of what normal people are doing. So
Well, I definitely agree with you. I guess like it's just like normally these experiences would be accompanied with like career accolades or some sort of hyper knowledge specialization in some crazy area. But for example, it's like imagine saying like, oh my gosh, like what's some event we would witness in Moscow? Like, oh my gosh, like I saw a diplomatic envoy pull up to MGIMO today. It's like, oh, cool. Like, what do you do? Oh, I'm an English teacher. It's like, well, that
yeah.
doesn't make much sense.
Did you get to see any like random cool people from like the Russian government or like diplomats at MGIMO?
I mean, I mean, I don't even know if this is possible. I swear one time when I was an English teacher and was walking around Moscow on the streets, I swear I saw Snowden once. I mean,
Maybe. I
I mean,
mean,
I don't know if this is true, but I swear he looked identical to Snowden.
hmm.
Um, Andrei Bezrikov was a teacher at MGIMO, like the
Oh, yeah,
strategic
yeah.
guy. He's actually he was like an undercover
Harvard
agent.
professor.
Was he a Harvard professor?
Yeah, I didn't know he taught at Harvard,
That's crazy.
and he was at the Harvard Kennedy Center or whatever it's called for like study of
Wow.
international relations, and yeah, now he's at MGIMO. I think he actually got a degree at Harvard. Um, Very smart dude. Yeah, I actually went to the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum last year, and he was there, and like got to listen to him talk. Um, he is a very smart dude. Uh, but yeah, I never got to meet him in person or anything. I just like listened to him, and yeah, he's a
Just like
professor.
I think he gave some like big open lectures that were like about
Yeah,
Ukraine or something.
yeah.
Um,
Um,
anyone else? It was mainly just like seeing people in passing or hearing that like so and so is the son of someone related to the diplomatic envoy of so and so.
yeah,
But no one crazy big. What about you?
yeah. I one time I was like, my first year, I was standing outside the dean's office and like talking to some girl, where she was like, sort of like said two words to some random girl. I was like, who is this? And then I hear after she like left, someone told me like, "Oh, that's um, Dmitry Pskov's stepdaughter." I was like, "What? Are you serious?" I could have like been flirting with this girl like a bit, like you know, So like I was just standing in line, but yeah, that was kind of interesting experience. Like, but the thing is though, I want to hear your perspective on this. I don't think we touched on this, but um, there's different types of MGIMO students. Like you have like the super hardworking, just genius level like students who don't come from like a family that's like wealthy or anything. Then you have also smart, but they're like less hardworking or they take it less serious. Students who are like from like really wealthy like
Yeah.
families. So you see them on Instagram. They're like one weekend they're in Dubai, next weekend south of France. I'm like thinking like, how are you like studying MGIMO in the bachelor's program? Like last week you were like freaking south of France. Like how does that work? Like, you know, like
Especially post sanctions, there's like no flights. They have to fly to
yeah,
Istanbul.
yeah,
Um, yeah, no, I was gonna say that's actually very interesting. But so as you know, those are called like the contract versus the budget students. And the
yeah.
contracts are the ones who have to pay for their education, and budget is like full scholarship plus tuition. And it's funny because like as you said, these two types of students have completely opposite vibes of each other, like the way they dress. The rich ones dress like oligarchs. And my friend Will and I, we used to walk around MGIMO and we literally look at people and say, that's a budget, that's a contract, just based on the way
Yeah.
people looked.
But I
So
think there's a stereotype that the people that like бюджетники, they're it's not бюджетники, контрактники or whatever they're called. I don't know what the Russian word is, but like yeah, where they like pay the tuition. Some of those people, there's a stereotype they're like not as smart. That is absolutely not true. I've met some of these like really freaking smart like people. They don't even come to class ever, and then like the professors like they comes to the exam and they're like, how come you didn't come to class? Like I'm gonna fail you unless you give this excellent answer at this exam here, and they like end up passing. Like um that's something I noticed was kind of interesting as well.
I think it's one of those things where it's like if someone comes from like a super wealthy background like that, I bet their parents have instilled like a set of values of what like really matters. So they probably know like the grades don't matter. I just have to get the diploma from MGIMO. So they have like a super high level of pragmaticism and street smarts. Whereas like
Yeah,
the other
maybe.
people are a lot more focused on the actual curriculum, that sort of thing.
Hmm. And I think the third, so the last category of students at MGIMO, I would say the international students. And
Yeah.
there's a whole range of from good to bad on that. But yeah, I'd say there's three types of MGIMO students. You have the international students who are already weird because they are international students at MGIMO. Then you have the kontraktniki and then the budgetniki. I don't know if you categorize the students in any other way other than that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. And I was also going to say the cool thing about MGIMO is, as you know, it's a really small campus, like very close and tight-knit corridors. So the cool thing is like you run into people, you meet people, you can meet some really influential people. Whereas I'm sure if you go to like University of Michigan, like I'm sure there's influential people there, but you're never going to meet them.
Yeah. Another question I wanted to ask you is like, did you have any issues with the fact that you're an American at MGIMO? Did like the administration or did any of the professors like kind
No,
of
no,
bug
no. I
you or did
think
that help you maybe?
most Russians, the first question is like, why on earth are you in Russia? But the second thing is that they're really happy and appreciative of the fact that you would take the time, energy, and money to come learn about their culture, especially as an American with no Russian roots whatsoever. People ask
Yeah.
me, "Oh, do you have any Chechen roots? Are you Armenian?" And I just say, "Нет, нет, я только американец. I'm just an American." Um, I did have one bad experience a little bit after the war started, where I remember I was in the MGIMO gym.
Oh no, the connection is like
But I
not
was
working. Here, hold
oh,
up, hold up. So I heard you were at the MGIMO gym. I didn't hear anything after that. I
sorry,
can
is
hear
it
you
back?
now.
Okay,
Yeah, yeah,
okay.
it's back. It's back.
Yeah. So anyway, I was in the MGIMO gym and like I was speaking English on the phone or maybe to my other friend, one of the other international students. There was some guy from like, oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, in the MGIMO gym, hopefully it works this time. In the MGIMO gym, speaking English to my friend, guy from the deep Russian provinces comes over to me and like like trying to intimidate me a little bit. And in Russian he says, "This is Russia. We don't speak English here. We speak Russian."
Yeah.
But
I was thinking
outside of
like,
that, outside of
meanwhile,
that,
the
not any bad.
like the motto of MGIMO is like friendship of peoples and students, like дружба студентов, like yeah, and like that's cool about MGIMO is like it's the one institution that teaches the most languages, and you'd think like MGIMO students would be, but I think that's just one very tiny
Yeah,
example of a
definitely.
negative experience. But I mean, if I were to categorize my experiences into like two categories, good or bad for MGIMO, I would be like 99% good. Like honestly, I had like there was like one or two, and we had the same professor. I don't want to say his name, but for history or it was like study of international relations. Uh, that dude was very annoying, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. But yeah, it was definitely after the war. I think started. There was just some professors like kind of just like gave you a little bit harder over time. It's like I can only think of two examples of that, but one of the dudes was just study of international relations, dude. Like I think the whole department is a little bit off, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One other big difference between like American education and Russian is like in Russia they really have this idea like the professor's the god of the classroom and that you're there to sort of receive and absorb like information. Like there's not really a whole lot of discussion, which has pros and
Exactly.
cons. Because in America it's all about facilitating your critical thinking abilities, which is certainly useful, but the Russian approach is right in the sense that most people are not educated enough to actually have opinions. Um, so as a student, you should sort of have that perspective of humility, which I appreciate about MGIMO.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I did not even like I didn't remember that. Like in at MGIMO, like in the US, we're taught like this creative approach where like the students are on the same level as the professor somewhat, and like the students can like have these creative ideas and stuff. Whereas like in Russian universities, that's not the case. Like they think, and it's sort of a good approach. It's logical. Where like your goal at the university is just to memorize all this information, and then after you finish the university, then you can start thinking about how it all comes together and everything. But that was like a negative side because my approach to like doing presentations or writing papers, it would either be like really good from like the professor because the professor's like, wow, you like seem like a master of like thinking of all these big ideas and stuff and putting them together. Or like a presentation, it'd be like, wow, this is a super creative presentation. They give me really good grades. Other times it'd be like, you didn't follow the structure. Like the structure is like
Yeah,
this, and you did this creative junk, and we don't do creative junk here. Like that was something I noticed.
definitely. What was I gonna ask you? I was gonna say, oh yeah, no, I remember that like for example, as I mentioned, like in Russia, the professors that got out of the classroom. As a student, I remember like feeling a little bit like sometimes like, oh, like I tried to say something, my ideas were neglected. But then on the other hand, I remember the moment I graduated, I would talk to my professors, and it's like all of a sudden they almost like viewed me as like equal and like treated me like I was an
Mm.
expert all of a sudden.
Yeah, yeah. I think maybe I'll ask you like a few more questions, but we're getting close to the hour here, and we can always do another call because I didn't realize that this education topic you can talk for hours on this.
Oh,
It turns out,
100%, yeah.
and maybe we could. Yeah, okay. We'll talk after the video ends, but about like future ideas. But I'll ask you a few more questions here. So like, um, if okay, in this hypothetical situation, if you had known that you could have like gone to MGIMO for like your bachelor's degree instead of going to Utah State, do you think you would have done that, or do you think like studying
Ooh.
at Utah State was like, um,
Ooh. That's a very good question. Generally, I like to say that I don't have any regrets in my life because, like, the
not
choices you
regrets, not regrets, but like
I,
if you
of
just
course,
had known
think
a piece of
do
information at that time?
uh, I would say that going to Utah taught me a lot about human nature and psychology because it's a very, very controlled ideological state. And I would say that I needed such an extreme experience to sort of formulate some of my later opinions in life.
Mhm.
Um, so for me, it seems like it was necessary. But objectively, in terms of maximizing like enjoyment of the experience or my learning, I think I would have done my bachelor's degree at MGIMO.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I mean I I'm glad I did my bachelor's at MGIMO. Would I do a master's at MGIMO? Absolutely not. I'm done with Russian University like after that. But like um but yeah, like
Would you consider going to like HSE or any other Russian universities?
no, no. I once you have a job that like pays you like as much as like the rector gets paid MGIMO, there's no going back to like being a student anymore.
Definitely.
It's just like, so I'm like, yeah, I have this really cool gig right now where I'm like paid to learn essentially. So I'm super thankful for that. But yeah, so like maybe last question, I want to ask you more like macro perspective. Maybe this is like the last question I ask you here. But so like looking at a macro perspective, what do you think it means for two Americans, and we know a lot of Americans who have gone from the United States and studied in Russia. What do you think it means that two Americans our age after high school or after undergraduate, they go to Russia to study at a university there, and they end up really really liking it and kind of being shocked that by what they experience? Like, what do you think that means? Like, if you're thinking about like these empires, like the United States, superpowers, and like
Oh,
like the perspective of like
mm.
2000 years of like historical things going on. What does it say about two people from this so-called superpower decide to go to this, what people thought in that superpower is this declining empire, and they end up like really really enjoying their time there? What do you think about that?
So I'm gonna actually sort of flip the answer on you a little bit because you're asking about the
Okay.
macro. I think it actually depends on the micro. I wouldn't say that has anything to do with, well, it has to do with both. I would say that it has more to do with you and I rather than the United States and Russia, because I think that it just indicates to me that the United States has become so fully entrenched with certain ideologies and has become so averse to actual critical thinking and actual discussion of free ideas to the point where when we go to another country, especially a place like Russia, it feels like a breath of fresh air. And that is a very, very sad state of affairs.
I would agree with that. I think that it shows that there is no, well, this is my personal opinion, but I feel like there's no more freedom of expression or thought of like ideas without some sort of ideology, whatever you want to call it, the ideology. But there's some sort of ideology in the United States where that prevents people from just exploring ideas. And like in Russia, studying MGIMO, and it's the same with other universities, you can genuinely study your subject without having some sort of overarching ideology trying to filter what you say. So
So
that's what I think it says. Yeah.
tell me what you think about this. I think that one of the biggest differences between Russia and the United States is that in America, we have this idea of American exceptionalism, the idea that we are the best. But in Russia, they have aspirations towards individual exceptionalism. So when you look at all the Soviet propaganda and the depictions of people, the depictions of science, literature, art, people have this idea that they should fully develop all of their capabilities, their intellect, that in life, like the point is almost to become like this artistic genius. Whereas like in the US, I don't get that sense at all.
Yeah.
I
It's
remember so um just
hold
talking about
on. Sorry.
just one thing.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead. But I
Go
want to. Yeah.
American culture, and I don't want to get too much into it. I remember because like I said, I wanted to escape California because I thought it was like a little bit liberal. I wanted to see what things were like in Utah. But then in Utah, which is conservative, I encountered a whole different set of like problems. I'm super interested in psychology and evolutionary psychology. And I remember I used to be at the hot tub at Utah State. I'd be discussing with people about like mate preferences, like why do people like the people they do? Why are people attracted to certain people? And I remember I was just explaining something very simple about evolution to just like a group of guys, and like I was saying this and they're like, I don't know, man. I think if she likes you, she likes you. And like I think in America there's such like this anti-intellectual, anti-idea sentiment, whereas a Russian would absolutely eat that conversation up. They would take any opportunity they have to further their personal, individual knowledge and exceptionalism.
Yeah. That's interesting. One thing you said that I really liked what you said is that you said that like the Russian exceptionalism like concept is where the individual perfects themselves. But I would take that a step further, where it's like the individual perfects themselves in order for the collective to be more perfect or something more.
Yes.
um yeah, that's actually a really interesting point where it's like it's almost like there is definitely still like this collectivism ideology, not ideology, it's some sort of like just, it's like Russians, they this is for another conversation. I can talk for hours on this. This is why we got to do another call. But yeah, if I just wrap this thought up, like there's definitely still this like I don't know, like collective mentality in Russia where like Russians associate with Russians. They like you're walking down the street and you see another Russian person, like you kind of feel like, oh, I'm half Russian, they're Russian. Like I feel something there. And I think and I've talked to other Russians about this, where like Russians, they feel some sort of like brotherhood or something. Whereas in the United States, you don't have that. Like you just you go to a restaurant here and like you see some other Americans and you just don't really feel like some sort of collective thing. Maybe I'm so far gone anti-America that I don't feel that, but I don't feel that. I never felt that when I was like even super pro-America, like, so
I was going to say, I think it's often the opposite. Here in the UK, whenever I meet other Americans, I feel like there's immediately almost a sense of animosity between us.
mm,
And I'm not trying to do that. I usually come in from a friendly, open perspective, but like, I don't know. They say that phenotypically you can guess whether or not someone's political opinions based on their appearance. And I feel
oh
like the
yeah,
majority of Americans, like when they look at me, they can almost like tell like something's off. And they're like
I
immediately.
agree. Yeah.
I don't know what you think about this, but
No, I absolutely agree. Um, Dude, we got to do another call because we're getting to like the outside the educational theme, and we had a bunch of these questions that are like super spicy. We didn't talk any of the spicy stuff. We have a lot of spicy discussion
definitely.
topics here. but um but yeah, man, I think this what do you think? Is a good stopping point maybe?
Yeah,
And maybe we
cool.
can get on a call after, like check all the audio and everything, and then maybe
Yeah,
discuss how
sounds
we
good.
want to edit this video and future ideas. What do
Sounds
you
good.
think?
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Alex, and we'll do another episode soon.
Awesome, man. Thanks for this idea. This is awesome. This is really, really enjoyable.